Hi, I'm Mike Hudson, Director of the Museum of the American Printing House for the Blind. Welcome to the Redux presentation of sessions from the Hidden Legacies of Helen Keller Symposium, which was held in Louisville, Kentucky on September 17th and 18th, 2022. The symposium, with primary sponsorship from the American Printing House for the Blind and the Filson Historical Society, brought together scholars, writers, and Keller enthusiasts from across North America. In 2020, the American Foundation for the Blind Helen Keller Archive arrived at our museum on 23 pallets. And since then, our staff has been busy cataloging, describing, measuring, and inventorying this most amazing history of one of the most amazing women of the 19th and 20th centuries. I'm sitting in front of her desk from her house at Arcan Ridge. Helen Keller was a writer, activist, advocate, ambassador, and world traveler who profoundly affected the way the world thinks about people with disabilities. And yet, she is little understood, often frozen in time as a little girl with her hand under the water pump behind her parents' home in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Our symposium was just a beginning effort to bring together the most current scholarship in innovative ways to better understand Keller, her companion Anne Sullivan, and her times. We hope you enjoy the series. Each session will be dedicated to a single speaker from the symposium. Our first session on Saturday morning was titled Curiosity, Pedagogy, and Tools, and looked at the history of education and literacy for people who are blind or deafblind from three very different perspectives. Our third speaker in that session, writer Cristina Hartman, grew up half in and half out of the world of the hearing and the seeing. She has her own understanding of the use of multiple languages, multiple communication styles, and multiple techniques. And it was from Cristina that I learned that ASL interpreters can speak with an accent. Ms. Hartman was interested in communication and the very different ways she has been taught and skills she has needed to acquire in order to communicate. Cristina Hartman is a writer whose fiction and nonfiction stories explore how our perception can shape our relationships. Her articles have been featured in Vox, Newsweek, and Medium, among others. She is a graduate of Cornell University, the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and was once a regulatory lawyer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cristina Hartman. And as Mike said, yes, I am a writer, former lawyer from Pittsburgh. I'm here today to talk about some of my experiences and observations when it comes to communication and language choices. I grew up deaf and became deafblind later on. The biggest issue that impacts both communities significantly are these language and communication choices. Sometimes we are in a position to make choices for ourselves, but oftentimes these choices are made for us. In thinking back on my life and my experiences, I've thought about how much, both on a personal level and on a political level, my choices have been impacted. And that impacts all of us. And I want to describe what I mean by personal level. It's individual circumstances in which we find ourselves, our personal goals that we strive to attain, that drive some of the choices that we make on a daily basis. On the political level, what I'm talking about is social forces that have an impact on the choices that we make. So before I delve further into my talk here this morning, I'd like to share two things. Firstly, I'd like to share that I'm presenting today in American Sign Language. So you're all hearing my presentation through a voice interpreter. And I also have a protactile interpreter standing behind me, supporting with environmental feedback, which is really the feedback that you all are giving as an audience. So I can access that. And I can feel more connected with you all during my presentation. The second caveat that I would like to address is that there is a big issue, first of all, that there's only 25 minutes devoted to these complex issues. And the second caveat is that I have drawn a lot from my personal experience, which is a single experience. And so with those two things out of the way, let's proceed with the show. When I was born, my parents assumed that they were going to have an experience similar to what they had when my sister was born, and that I would be similar to my sister, and that I would be speaking English and Portuguese at home, as they did. Portuguese, because my parents are Brazilian immigrants, and so naturally spoke Portuguese at home. English, because we were living in America. And America is an English-speaking country. When they discovered that I was deaf at the age of 4 months, those expectations, those thoughts, those hopes were really thrown out the window. My parents were confronted with choosing language and communication methods for me, languages for me. And admittedly, they said that they were overwhelmed with the options right at the outset. And there was oral methods, there were signed approaches, sign methods, ASL, there was cued speech, there was a whole range of options that were kind of tossed out on the table. And they tried a few different things, and they tried oralism only, which didn't work, and ended up shifting to signed English. And really, it was signed exact English, specifically, which is bringing in the English grammar and English syntax into a visual context. So English syntax is segmental, it's linear, and bringing that into a visual realm sort of retains some of that linearity. Another reason for this decision on their part was personal to my parents. They were new to this country. They were still learning English themselves. So it was easier for them to pick up English if they were signing English with me. Signing all of the bits and pieces of English helped them to improve their language acquisition. On the political side of things, social workers and teachers counseled them and emphasized that English was the benchmark, right? English was what was considered superior. They advised my parents not to speak Portuguese in front of me. They said that if they did so, I would be confused, and I would confuse lip-reading Portuguese words with English words. And just so you all know, secret, I could tell the difference. They are distinguishable. They assumed, well, let me back up before I get to that assumption. So the experts, again, they prioritized English. And they used English as a benchmark to measure language acquisition and language fluency. They assumed that deaf children could pick up English the same way hearing children do through this method, using signed English instead of spoken English as a simple sort of one-for-one substitution. But in reality, things work a little different. Because what you're doing when you take an auditory language and you try to kind of foist it into a visual realm is you're changing the context. Again, language as an auditory language is segmental, and strange things happen when you put it into visual space. I remember watching my mom articulate herself in signed English, and she was a strict adherent. So I was watching for an extended period, while she kind of churned out bit by bit these English, the root word, the affix, the suffix, and finally would get to the end of this sort of chain of segments. And I knew where she was going before she got to the end of the chain, I'll tell you that. And for me, my dad, he was less of an adherent to strict English. I'll say he was more of a simple guy. He would sign things like cold outside coat, right? So I'd have to put the pieces together. Okay, what exactly do you mean, Dad? My sister, she fingerspelled like a champ, which was great. But it's slow. There's a lot of building anticipation as you go word by word by word through a sentence. Then when I started to interact with the deaf community outside my family, I started learning ASL. And it was amazingly different than what the language my family was using. It was a visual language that had arisen from a visual realm. And so it was embedded in that visual context. All the visual markers were three-dimensional. They were in three-dimensional space. So it was so much more cohesive. It was language intended for a visual language intended for a visual context, as opposed to an auditory language that was sort of twisted and shoved into a visual frame. So at the end of the day, it worked. It worked out okay for me and for my family in our circumstances. It was messy, albeit, but we were able to communicate with one another. It was good enough for us. But unfortunately, it's not good enough for everyone or for all children. Studies show that some deaf children don't succeed well in environments that I grew up in, similar to that which I grew up in. So these communication choices that we're confronted with, and for me, a new communication choice arose when I was 6 and the FDA approved cochlear implant technology for children. The decision for me to get an implant was a very pragmatic one on the part of my parents. They had just discovered that I would become deafblind, and they really wanted me to have every possible advantage and opportunity in life that I could have. And they were worried, especially because they didn't have a lot of extended family in the country either for support. And so at that age, after receiving an implant, I started the long, arduous process of, first of all, learning how to hear. My brain essentially had to be rewired and learn how to process sound. And at first, it was strange. I could sort of feel the synapses and the neural networks building. It was an uncomfortable, an edgy feeling. And I even started to feel at one point like sound came in shapes. Like the letter C, for example. The letter C felt like a bubble. It felt very bubbly to me. And I remember some of those early sort of cognitions, sensory cognitions that I had. And then also, I had to learn how to listen to others. So first to hear, then to listen, to figure out what sound meant when I really listened to others. And then, third and last, finally, learned how to speak myself. And not perfect by any means, but good enough to get by. So really, it was a 9-year process for me. I had a lot of drills, a lot of training that happened in really small windowless rooms. Yeah, so during that time, there was a big debate going on when it came to cochlear implants and children being implanted. And I think it brought up some important issues around what kind of language would be best suited to children with implants, any safety issues that might arise that were unforeseen at the outset, and then what cultural identity, would these children be ascribing to? For me, personally, my issues were a little different. For me, it was, how can I maintain the fluency in signing that I already had when I had developed as a youngster? I already had that really strong deaf identity from those first 6 years of life signing in my family and with the extended deaf community. So now I could speak and hear, okay, I can add that to my repertoire. And I thought, okay, well, now as a deaf-blind person, then I've got the hearing piece, I've got the speaking piece, I've got the signing piece, great. But culturally, I'm a deaf-blind person who can see and hear. And I learned to see and hear some and speak. And I learned to move between the deaf world and the hearing world. Both worlds are wonderful. The deaf world has such amazing communication fluency. I can understand everything very, very clearly, and everything, information is at the ready. The community is very, very close-knit, a lot of shared information. But the hearing world is vast. I discover a lot of diversity, variation, hearing people from all over who are doing different things and exposing me to different things, educational resources, opportunities, ideas. But to fully avail myself of those opportunities for someone who's deaf, even someone who has a cochlear implant, does have a cost. It is expensive. Because a cochlear implant is not the same as quote-unquote normal hearing. I call it low-resolution hearing, which is, I guess, akin to a low-resolution image. You can zero in on some words, but there's a lot of filling in that needs to happen. It is mentally taxing. I remember attending law school, and as a lawyer, practicing early on in that career, and I'd get home exhausted, just absolutely wore out. I'd fall down on the sofa, and I'd take off my cochlear implant, and just kind of lose myself in reality TV is honestly what I did. And then other communication issues arose when I became deaf-blind 8 years ago. So I was adjusting to my new life during that period of time and confronted some of the hard facts of my reality. I came up against communication issues as a deaf-blind person. I realized that spoken English and tactile ASL, in and of themselves, were not enough. I no longer could pick up on people's body language. So I wasn't getting environmental information. I wasn't picking up on some of the things that they maybe had been referencing. And the spots that I had been accustomed to filling in, those gaps, became wider and more difficult to cohere. I could no longer read a person's facial expressions when we were engaged in conversation. So I didn't even know how people were receiving what I said, or how they were responding. And tactile ASL wasn't much better, frankly. Because again, ASL is a visual language. 40% of the language takes place on the hands, okay, in ASL. 60% is on the face, on the body, and in the space around the signer. So it's really easy to misunderstand things tactily when they're meant to be seen. For example, we've got a hand shape of an open hand, like the number 5, okay? Lots of different words depend on the location where you would place that hand, or any hand shape really. There's hand shape and then there's location. So take that open 5 hand, okay? Your thumb comes up to touch your chin. That is mom. Then if your thumb moves to your forehead, that is dad. But when I'm receiving tactily, I have my hand on the back of the person's hand, and depending on their height, depending on my height, it's very hard to discern whether they're signing mom at the chin or dad at the forehead. So there's frequent confusion there because I just can't discern those spatial locations. The impacts were profound. I started feeling a lot more concern in social situations, a lot of social anxiety. I didn't want to meet new people, and got to a point where I was withdrawing from social interaction. And then I found out about this new language that's been emerging called protactile language, PT. And I thought, this is interesting. Okay, so it's an emerging tactile language, but it's emerging from the ground of touch. So you use the body, the surface of the body as a canvas, the space across the chest, down kind of the bicep, the upper arm, the forearm, and the hand, so that information is received proprioceptively. It's much more clear and precise, and it also had some philosophical underpinnings that changed how deafblind people kind of interacted in the world and encouraged direct interaction. It's a touch-first approach. So if a person wants to talk with me or I want to talk with a person, I touch the person and we get in contact with one another kind of directly first. Same thing with the environment. If I want to know where I am, I'm not going to rely on another person first and foremost to tell me. I'm going to reach out and touch, find what's around me, and get familiar with it through touch. And it was novel. Throughout history, most deafblind people had intermediaries. And those intermediaries, whether they be guides or interpreters, they inserted themselves between the deafblind person and the world around us. So I started learning protactile last year. I'm not fluent by any means yet, but the impact for me is already evident. I started an MFA program because I felt more prepared. I felt like it gave me more preparedness to understand some of these intense academic concepts, a stronger, more robust footing. Also, in going out into the world, doing things like giving talks like I'm giving today. Hello, I'm now able to stand in front of you and do things like this because of protactile. That power to fully communicate and be immersed in touch with others and the world around me did basically leave me feeling more empowered. But there are definitely challenges. We live in a society that's distantist, where touch is taboo. Also, protactile is a very, very young language. It's in its infancy, and you have people, deafblind people, scattered throughout the United States, which presents a challenge for us to get together and share that in-person language that's corporeal. And so to develop language, it takes interaction, and it takes us coming together. And to learn language requires that as well. So we're all scattered across the states, and that's difficult. So time is running out. I want to wrap up, but before doing so, a final note. I've been talking about languages in different contexts. The visual context, the audio-visual context, and the tactile context. But I want to emphasize that even though I've separated them out this way, they aren't mutually exclusive, and there doesn't need to be hard and fast boundaries between them. Protactile is its own language, yes. But the techniques that you find can be used in, whether you're speaking English, using an auditory language, or whether you're using a visual language, you can still incorporate touch and some of these protactile techniques. You know, if you're hearing, if you're deaf, still using touch with me or with deafblind people is still possible. We can bridge the distances between us. Two final thoughts I'd like to share as well. We are here today at the Helen Keller Symposium, honoring this legacy. And I've been thinking, to myself, reflecting on the past 40 years of my life. And I think it's worth all of us considering the both personal and political aspects that impacted Helen Keller's communication choices and those of others in prior eras. And another thing I think I'd like to share with all of you and encourage you to think about is what's different and what's the same when we consider language and communication issues. Thinking about what faces us today in today's society and world versus what faced those who came before us. So that concludes my portion. I want to thank you all for your time. I'd like to especially thank my team of interpreters working with me today, Hal for voicing, Aiko for their support, and Annie for being a fantastic co-navigator and communication facilitator and interpreter. So thank you also to the American Publishing House for the Blind for sponsoring this wonderful conference, or hosting this wonderful conference and symposium. And if you would like to clap at the conclusion of my talk, you can do it protactile style, which is stomping. I don't know how good this crowd. Thank you all very, very much.